At my dad's funeral, the silence was heavy, the kind that presses down on your chest until breathing feels optional. We were standing in a massive stone cathedral in Denver, Colorado, surrounded by the upper tier of the logistics world. Board members, investors, executives who flew in on private jets and whispered about margins even in moments like this. But my sister-in-law, Madison, wasn't there to mourn. She was there to claim the throne. She reached for the microphone before the priest could finish the final prayer. Her heels clicked sharply against the marble floor as she turned to face the room. Her voice was crisp, rehearsed, slicing clean through the grief. She announced that my brother, Lucas Carter, was officially stepping in as the new CEO of our $540 million logistics empire. She smiled like she was unveiling a new product launch. She scanned the room, waiting for applause, and that's when it happened. A sound rolled through the cathedral's high-end sound system, a loud, unmistakable, dry chuckle. It came from the direction of my father's coffin. People froze, heads turned. Lucas went pale. It wasn't a ghost, it was a recording, but the fear that crossed my brother's face was very real. To understand why my father was laughing from the grave, you have to go back about 10 minutes. Lucas and Madison had been treating the funeral like a networking event. They weren't grieving, they were campaigning. I watched them from the front pew. Lucas moved down the aisle shaking hands with board members, accepting condolences for a position he hadn't even legally assumed yet. Madison leaned in close to groups of executives, whispering about the future vision, pointing at the vaulted ceilings and stained glass like she was already planning renovations. They looked at me like I was part of the furniture. Lucas leaned over, adjusting a tie that probably cost more than my monthly rent. "Don't worry, Emily," he whispered, his voice thick with condescension. "We'll find a place for you in operations. Maybe the records department. Someone has to keep the paperwork moving while the adults run the company." He smirked. He called me a worker bee, a glorified secretary. He thought he was untouchable because he was the firstborn son. He thought the blood in his veins functioned like an unlimited line of credit. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I didn't ask him for respect. I felt something colder settle in instead, a clean, clinical calm. I looked across the aisle at Henry. Henry Wallace had been my father's chief of staff for nearly 40 years. He'd been there when this company was nothing more than a rented warehouse and 3 leased trucks. He was holding a small remote control in his hand. I met his eyes and gave him one subtle nod. That was the signal. Henry stood up and walked toward the back of the cathedral. The heavy oak doors closed behind him. Then came the sound, the deadbolt sliding into place. The click echoed louder than it should have in the silence. Henry turned, raised the remote, and aimed it at the massive projector screen mounted behind the altar, set up for the eulogy video. He pressed play. The screen flickered to life. It wasn't a montage of fishing trips or birthday parties. It was my father, Robert Carter, seated at his desk staring straight into the camera. He didn't look peaceful. He looked like he was about to fire someone. The chuckle echoed again through the cathedral, freezing Lucas and Madison where they stood. The premature coronation was over. The audit was about to begin. As the congregation turned toward the glowing screen, my thoughts drifted away from the cathedral, back to where this empire actually lived, not in conference rooms with glass walls and leather chairs, but in frozen rail yards at 3 in the morning. While Lucas was busy attending tech summits in Miami or posting photos from Formula One races, I was standing in ankle-deep slush at a distribution hub outside of Pueblo, negotiating with union leaders to keep freight moving through a blizzard. For 10 years, I was the ghost in the system, the invisible hand fixing failures before anyone knew something was broken. I missed my best friend's wedding because a shipment of medical equipment was stuck in customs in Vancouver. I spent my 25th birthday in a server room rebooting a tracking system after a cyber attack. I didn't do it because I loved pressure. I did it because I believed in a deal that turned out to be a lie. I convinced myself that competence was a currency, that if I worked hard enough, if I made myself indispensable, merit would eventually outweigh bloodline. I wore my silence like a uniform. In logistics, a woman who speaks up is emotional. A woman who quietly fixes problems is an asset. So I became the asset. I audited fuel contracts, I rerouted shipping lanes, I cut $12 million in operational waste in one fiscal year. I told myself this was dignity. I told myself I was honoring the family name. In reality, I was forging my own chains. Chains made of obligation and patience. I thought staying invisible proved loyalty. I thought my father saw me. I thought he understood that while Lucas was the mascot, I was the engine. Sitting there watching Madison clutch her designer handbag, I realized something too late. My silence hadn't been strategy, it had been permission. By not demanding recognition, I'd allowed them to erase me. I let them treat my labor like a natural resource, something they could extract endlessly without cost. I wasn't a partner, I was infrastructure. You don't thank the foundation of a building for holding it up. You just assume it will always be there. That assumption was their fatal mistake. They thought my silence meant submission. They thought I was quiet because I was weak. They didn't understand I was quiet because I was keeping score. Every stolen idea, every missed holiday, every deal Lucas took credit for, it was all logged. I wasn't just working, I was accumulating equity in a ledger they couldn't see. And as I looked at my father's face on that screen, I knew something else. He had been keeping score too. He'd watched Lucas treat the company like a personal expense account, and he'd watched me treat it like something alive that needed protecting. The invisible chains were about to snap, and the sound was going to be deafening. To understand why I felt no guilt watching my brothers sweat in that cathedral, you have to see what happened 3 days earlier. Our father had been dead for less than 4 hours. The coroner had just left the house, but Lucas and Madison didn't go to the funeral home, they went straight to the corporate headquarters. I was already there, sitting in my father's office with Henry, trying to stabilize the stock price and reassure our global partners that the company wasn't about to collapse overnight. We were grieving, but we were working, because that's what this business demands when the person holding it together disappears overnight. Then the elevator doors opened and the circus arrived. Lucas walked in like he'd just conquered a nation. He wasn't wearing black. He was wearing a navy suit that screamed new money. He didn't ask about funeral arrangements. He didn't ask about employees. He walked straight to the massive oak desk my father had built by hand and ran his finger along the edge. "This has to go," he said casually. "Too rustic. I want glass, chrome, something that says visionary." Madison followed him in, already on her phone. She wasn't calling relatives, she was calling an interior designer. "We need to gut this entire floor," she announced, her voice echoing in the room. "It smells like old men and diesel fuel. We need a private lounge, a wet bar, maybe even a helipad on the roof. Lucas deserves an entrance." Henry stood up. His face was gray with grief, but his voice was steady. He told them we had a liquidity issue to manage. He told them drivers were calling about their pensions. Lucas laughed. He actually laughed. He looked at Henry, a man who had taught him how to tie his shoes, and said, "Relax, you're not going to be around much longer anyway. We need fresh blood. You're old news. Consider this your notice." Then he turned to me. I was holding a stack of urgent shipping manifests. Lucas plucked them from my hands and tossed them onto the floor. "And you, Emily," he said with a sneer, "we need a real face for this company, someone with charisma. You can stay on to handle filing and coffee orders. You're good at the boring stuff. Just keep the lights on while I spend the profits." They spent the next hour talking about selling off the trucking fleet to buy a villa in Napa because remote work is the future. They talked about dismantling a 50-year operation to fund a permanent vacation. They were paper kings. They thought the title was the power. They didn't understand that power comes from the respect of the people who actually do the work, and in 60 minutes, they had lost every ounce of it. I didn't argue. I bent down, picked the papers off the floor, and stacked them neatly. I looked at Henry and saw the fire in his eyes. That was the moment the plan was born. They wanted the title. Fine, they could have it. They just didn't realize the crown they were stealing was made of lead, and it was going to drag them straight to the bottom. Back in the cathedral, the video on the screen didn't cut to family photos or fishing trips. It didn't soften. My father leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and stared through the camera. His eyes were hard, flinty, the eyes of a man who had stared down union strikes and supply chain collapses for 4 decades. He cleared his throat, the sound echoing through the cathedral like a gavel striking wood. "Lucas," his recorded voice said, "you've spent the last 10 years waiting for this moment, waiting for me to die so you could stop asking permission and start spending the principal. You thought my generosity was love. You thought every check I wrote was endorsement." The image shifted. The video shrank into the corner of the screen, replaced by a high-resolution spreadsheet. Rows of numbers filled the wall behind the altar, color-coded in red. A ledger of sins. "Let's review the portfolio," my father narrated, his voice clinical. "Item 1, the Miami nightclub. You called it a cultural investment. Cost, $2,400,000. Status, bankrupt in 6 months. Item 2, vintage car restoration venture. Cost, $1,800,000. Status, liquidated for scrap. Item 3, personal branding consultants. $400,000 a year." The cathedral was silent. You could hear the air vents humming. Madison stopped smiling. She stopped whispering. She just stared at the screen as the numbers rolled by. It was a public audit of their entire lifestyle. "People told me I was spoiling you," my father continued. "They said I was ruining you by giving you everything you asked for. They were wrong. I wasn't spoiling you, I was testing you. I gave you unlimited resources to see if you would build something or burn it down. I wanted to know if the golden child could actually create value, or just paint everything gold and call it success." He hadn't been blind to Lucas's incompetence. He'd been documenting it, allowing Lucas to consume his own future because it was the only way to prove, beyond emotion, that he wasn't fit to lead. He gave him the rope, and Lucas tied the noose himself. "You failed the test," my father said, the spreadsheet vanishing as his face filled the screen again. "You burned it all. But here's what you forgot. I don't give away capital without paperwork. Do you remember those standard agreements Henry had you sign every time I wired money? You never read them. You were too busy celebrating. But if you had, you'd know something very important." My father smiled. Not warm, not proud, precise. "Those weren't gifts, Lucas. They were loans. Loans against your inheritance. And by my math, you spent every single dollar." The spreadsheet vanished, replaced by a crisp scan of a legal document. White paper, black text. At the bottom, a bold blue signature looping across the page. Lucas Carter. My brother leaned forward, squinting, and I watched recognition hit him like a collision. His jaw slackened. His hands began to shake. "5 years ago," my father's voice continued evenly, "you needed bail money in Monaco. You needed it fast. You needed it quiet. You signed this promissory note and equity transfer agreement. You didn't read it. The font was small. You were hungover. Let me read the clause you skipped." The camera zoomed in on paragraph 4. "In the event the borrower's total debt exceeds $6 million, the borrower forfeits all future equity voting rights and inheritance claims. Said equity shall immediately transfer to any party who satisfies the outstanding debt on behalf of the company." The cathedral went completely still. My father paused, letting the language settle. "Last month, your debt reached $6,200,000. The company could have sued you, seized your condo, your cars, everything. But someone intervened. Someone paid it off. Someone used their performance bonuses, their savings, their sweat equity." The screen changed again. A bank transfer receipt filled the wall. Amount, $6,200,000. Sender, Emily Carter. "You didn't inherit this company, son. You sold it, piece by piece, drink by drink, mistake by mistake. And your sister bought it, at full market value.
She owns your shares, she owns your vote, she owns the chair you're sitting in right now. I watched Madison turn toward Lucas. There was no concern in her eyes, no loyalty, just the hollow realization of a bad investment. She started shouting at him, but her voice drowned beneath my father's final words. "Emily," he said, and for the first time his voice softened. "The keys are in the safe. Fire him." The screen went black, the projector hummed down, the lights came up slowly, revealing the wreckage of my brother's ego. Madison shoved him, accused him, walked away. Lucas stumbled toward me, pale and shaking, reaching for my hand. "This isn't real," he said. "You can't do this. We're family." I stepped back, looked at him, and saw what had always been there. A man wearing confidence he never paid for, power he only rented. I took a thick envelope from my purse and held it out. "This is a termination notice effective immediately. Henry has already revoked your access. Inside is a repayment schedule for the remaining $200,000 you owe the estate. First payment is due on the 1st. Don't be late." He stood there wordless while the board checked their watches and returned to work. Walking out felt lighter. The sun was brighter. Henry held hard the door open for me. He had done that for my father for 20 years. Today, he did it for me. We drove past the warehouse, the trucks lined up, the scale of it all. For the first time, the weight felt like ownership, not obligation. My phone buzzed. Madison filed for divorce. I blocked Lucas's number. I slept soundly that night. The empire was finally safe. If this story stayed with you longer than the video itself, don't walk away. Subscribe. This channel is for people who actually feel what they hear. And share this with someone who understands what earned power really means.